Afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this lunchtime seminar on psychiatric injuries. I appreciate you've all chosen to log on for today's seminar when you could have been going for a walk or watching TV, so I do appreciate you all taking the time this afternoon. I would have just asked if you could make sure your microphones are off and the seminar has been recorded, so if you don't wish to feature, if you could turn your camera off as well. With that said, I don't need to do a fire exit or alarms sounding or warning, so I'll get on with it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Hastings. I'm a senior associate and a solicitor advocate within BTO's litigation department. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr Mitchell Stewart, who's a consultant psychiatrist within NHS Tayside and who practices out of the Carsview Centre in Dundee. He will be a very familiar face and name to those of us who practice in insurance litigation in Scotland. Dr Stewart's going to be giving the second part of this webinar on psychiatric injuries. He has with a particular focus on somatisation and the issues which can arise in cases where there isn't a clear psychiatric or orthopaedic explanation for an individual's pain or their presentation. For me, this is really quite fascinating stuff, and these are often the most difficult and problematic claims that I, for example, would grapple with for clients when dealing with claims for psychiatric injuries. See example for involving somatisation or functional disorders or the like. So please do stay tuned to that. What I am going to do is to go through in brief, in a very whistle-stop tour, some of the law surrounding psychiatric injuries, and I have got some slides, albeit not too many of them. So if I can just get started, you'll see in the first slide, I think the answer to the question of whether you can claim damages for pure psychiatric injury is perhaps unsurprisingly yes. However, there are certain control mechanisms built into the law, the first one of which it must be reasonably foreseeable that a psychiatric injury would be sustained for a duty of care to be owed. There's no discernible difference in law between an organic or psychiatric injury, and a psychiatric injury had been historically described as what would the reasonable fortitude test be, i.e. would a person of reasonable fortitude have been susceptible to sustaining the injury. Nonetheless, really for a claim to arise, the injured party must have developed a recognised psychiatric condition or disorder. If shock, emotions, negative emotions, grief or distress are suffered, then those don't sound in damages apart from in very limited circumstances, for example, in fatal claims for loss of society. So the psychological reaction must be more than that, as there's really no duty to protect employees from unpleasant emotions, as some of my work colleagues may very well attest to. Just moving on, really, who can claim? This is important. This is a really fundamental point, as the law divides pursuers or claimants into two distinct classes. The first are characterised as primary victims, i.e. those persons who are directly involved in an accident or incident, albeit they're not physically injured. For those people, the ordinary rules of negligence would apply to the assessment of their claims. It's really, though, the second category of claimants named secondary victims, which has and continues to be the source of developing case law. This is a class of claimants or pursuers who are not physically injured, nor are they directly involved in the incident. But the law, for public policy reasons, as a lot of you will know, has placed limits on who can claim for and what a secondary claimant victim can be. And there are certain control mechanisms that the law has put in place which require to be fulfilled, and those principally arose or came out of the well-known case of Alcock against the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police, which arose as a consequence of the Hillsborough disaster. So, secondary victims, you can see on the slide the explanation for them. But what is a secondary victim? I've mentioned control mechanisms, and this has been an evolving concept that the courts have added to incrementally over the years. In brief terms, the McLaughlin case, which was a Scottish decision, made clear that firstly, the secondary victim must have a close tie of love and affection to the victim themselves. Secondly, that they must have been present at the scene of the incident or its aftermath, and they must have witnessed it through their own unaided senses, i.e. not through the medium of television or radio or the like. So that's what McLaughlin said back in 1982, which Alcock then developed on a few years later. Things have moved on a little bit since then, and we've got the well-known case of Taylor and A Novo UK Limited from 2013. Now that developed, I would say, the control mechanisms and fleshed them out a bit more. To the control mechanisms we've just looked at, Taylor added the requirement that it must be reasonably foreseeable that there's a risk of harm and that the claimant must have developed a recognised psychiatric disorder, and quite crucially, that the injury, i.e. the psychiatric problems developed, that must have been caused by the shock of taking in the event or its aftermath. Simply hearing about an incident or arriving at the hospital, perhaps to find a horrifying aftermath of what had happened to a loved one, doesn't suffice to bring the claimant within the Taylor and Novo control tests. So those are the control mechanisms that we're looking at. Firstly, for secondary victims, we've already discussed the control mechanism, or what's required to be a primary victim. So where does that leave the law on psychiatric injuries? Well, it was described as a bit of a patchwork quilt by Lord Stein in the case of White, and you can see I don't propose to repeat what he says, which I've put on the slide. It's an area of the law which has been on the move, and that continues to be the case. For me, the rules on the control mechanisms do seem a little bit arbitrary, and I'm not particularly convinced that the law is developed in a coherent way. And it's perhaps for that reason that cases continue to be brought before the courts, asking it to revisit, well, who can claim for a psychiatric injury and what are the circumstances surrounding that? That leads to the question for me, really, as to whether the law as it stands currently reflects the times. I'll give you one very quick example to do with direct perception, or how you take in an event. Should that continue to mean that the secondary victim has to physically be at the scene? What about, just take the example, if they have taken in the incident through the medium of a telephone call with a loved one, or a video call at the time, would that fall within the Alcock and Taylor criteria of taking it in with their own unaided senses? On one view, yes, but would the court allow the law to be expanded upon that, on that basis, given for public policy reasons it's reined in who can make a claim as a secondary victim? So if that's where the law is, where is the law really going to go, might be a question. And what reforms are we really looking at, or could we be looking at? Well, to the future, we have to look at the past, I would say. The Scottish Law Commission back in 2004 made proposals that to codify the common law and statute, as its view was that the law was an unprincipled set of rules with a number of defects. And I suppose to a large extent, that probably reflects what Lord Stein was saying a few years prior in the White case. There was a subsequent government consultation in 2013, in March of that year. I'm not entirely sure why it took that long for that. The results of that didn't find a particularly overwhelming appetite for reform. And for those of you who are interested, you can go online and very easily find the government response to the consultation from December 2013, in which it confirmed that it didn't intend legislating. And it's really remained that way for close to 10 years now. Will that change? I don't particularly see this area of the law being very high on the legislative agenda to consolidate the common law in a statute. What I perhaps think is more likely is that you'll continue to see the common law develop, and I'll say a wee bit more about that in a moment. So that's a wee bit of the theory. What I did want to do is to flag up a few cases for you. There are quite literally scores of interesting and pertinent cases from Scotland and south of the borders that I could have brought to your attention. In very brief terms, if you're interested in this area, I would encourage you to look at the cases on the slide for the following reasons, or to take the following points from them. Page v. Smith from the Court of Appeal in 1996 is an interesting one. For its ratio, that the simple point, if it can be established that an injury is reasonably foreseeable, there's no extra criteria required to establish that a psychological injury is foreseeable. So the fact that a psychological or psychiatric injury has been sustained isn't of itself a subspecies or particularly special. If an orthopaedic injury was foreseeable, or any injury, that's fine. The claimant need to do no more. The second case I've highlighted is that of Simmons against British Steel, for its ratio that if an injury is foreseeable, then the defender bears the consequences of that, even if the extent of the prevailing damage, if you want to put it like that, is greater than that which could have reasonably foreseen. And I would say that's quite apt in injuries, in psychiatric claims, where often, particularly in pain disorder cases or where there's unexplained symptoms, the consequences can be disproportionate to the original event causing injury. So that's one to bear in mind. The third case is that of Young against McVean, which was an inner house decision from the Court of Session in Scotland, which was a BTO case as it happens. That's an interesting case for you if you're interested to look at how the Court of Appeal or inner house in Scotland has dealt with the question of what caused the shock and the requirements that a secondary victim must meet in order for their psychiatric injury to have been caused by the event or its aftermath. In very brief terms, Young concerned a case where the pursuer was the mother of the deceased. She had come upon the accident aftermath, not knowing her son had been involved. She didn't know until later, and the shock was caused as a result of being told of his death. The inner house was very clear that the shock hadn't been caused as a result of seeing the incident in the aftermath. She didn't know he was involved at the time. So it's an example of the courts not being prepared to expand the direct perception part of the Taylor and Novo criteria. The fourth case on the list is that of Weddell against Glasgow City Council. This is an interesting little case that went to the Scottish Appeal Court last year concerning whether a bystander to the Glasgow bin lorry disaster who sustained a recognised psychiatric disorder could claim damages against the City Council for the negligence of the bin lorry driver. That claim failed, and it's a good example of the court reaffirming the Taylor and Novo ratio that there was no close tie of love and affection. So it wasn't prepared to expand a claim for psychiatric injury to a bystander who was no doubt in that case had sustained a recognised psychiatric disorder and had been at the scene to see it. However, it's probably the last two cases that are live cases, which I recommend you keep an eye on. They're conjoined English Court of Appeal decisions, which are due to be heard conjointly by the Supreme Court, probably early next year, given what's currently before the Supreme Court. And they arise in the context of two clinical negligence actions, really due to the failure to diagnose a particular problem leading to death. The lead case is Paul and the Royal Wolverhampton NHS Trust. In very brief terms, in Paul, there was a failure to diagnose a heart defect in 2012, and the deceased died in front of his daughters a couple of years later. The claim was dismissed on the basis of proximity, that the damage suffered was too remote from the original harm at hospital and the failure to properly diagnose the man. It failed on proximity. However, the Master of the Rolls, Sir Geoffrey Voss, wasn't particularly happy, or he was dissatisfied with having to apply Taylor and Novo, as it was his comment really that there was no logical reason for the rules on psychiatric injuries and the law on secondary victims to be as it were, and it was for the Supreme Court to determine if the law should be changed, and if so, to what degree. We'll just start leading into Dr. Stewart's talk, but it's worthwhile bearing in mind that when you're dealing with claims for psychiatric injury, they can actually be some of the most valuable that you could deal with on your book, and they can cause significant difficulties in establishing what's been caused by the accident, what hasn't been caused. I wanted to give you a real case study example that I dealt with a number of years ago. You'll see the details on the slide. That particular individual was very bright, had been very badly injured. The orthopaedic injuries resolved, but it was more the psychiatric problems and I suppose maybe the smorgasbord of psychiatric problems that were continuing to cause them difficulties. And the issue was what they would be able to do going forward and whether they would be able to achieve their full academic potential. One of the questions I tend to find when there's significant psychiatric injury, particularly in younger persons who have a long working life ahead of them, is it of a severity that renders them disabled? And if so, the degree of that disability and the effectiveness of treatment. So in the example that I've given you there, what was the pursuer looking for, really? Well, you can see the total. It's quite an eye-watering total, but it's probably the figure for salicium, given the extent of the suffering in the prolonged period that it had gone over. In that case, it was a number of years, going in from into teenage years into early 20s. It's really the figure for future loss. That's a high number. So that was a high-achieving individual that maybe couldn't achieve their potential. Now, it didn't settle for anywhere near that, but that was a stateable valuation for the pursuer if the wind had gone in their favour. You'll also see there's probably quite a small amount claimed for treatment costs. And maybe it wasn't surprising in that case, I'm not sure it's reflective of all cases, that there can be instances where further treatment just isn't going to work, or there's a limited capacity for a claimant or pursuer to engage with that treatment. So the point I would maybe leave you with is, when dealing with these claims from a legal perspective, and you're trying to work out how to advise clients on the potential value and the risks involved, often I've found that the timing of when treatment is proposed, the individual's capacity to engage with treatment, and the appropriateness of that particular individual to the treatment being proposed. Are they going to be able to deal with that? Is it suitable for them as a person? Are all very important points. Motivation is also a key component. Is the claimant motivated? Are there other extraneous factors which could be demotivating them? Do they have potentially a financial incentive for not getting better anytime soon, or at least until the litigation process has ended? So that's what I wanted to say about a brief whistle-stop tour on the law surrounding psychiatric injuries and a bit of a practical example. I'm now going to hand you over to Dr. Stewart to delve into the fascinating world of somatisation, and I shall stop participating, and I shall take over the role of perhaps the unglamorous assistant to go through Dr. Stewart's slides for him. Dr. Stewart, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Yes, as Mark said, my name's Mitchell Stewart. I'm a consultant in liaison psychiatry, which is general hospital psychiatry, and I'm based at Ninewells Hospital. So the people I see mostly have physical symptoms that have taken them into hospital, but also in the course of that admission, someone has identified comorbid mental health issues. And I would then be asked to kind of do an assessment. And the question is usually, does this person's physical disorder fully account for their collection of symptoms? So what is somatization? You can see on this slide, it's a subconscious process. So we don't try to do it, by which emotional distress or upset is expressed as physical symptoms. And it's not an illness, it's a process. And we all have the capacity to do it, and we all do it. I mean, for example, if I were to be experiencing abdominal pain, I end up having an endoscopy, and then 3 days later I get a telephone call from the hospital to say, oh, we've brought your appointment forward, can you come up to see the consultant? You know, you can bet your boots that my abdominal symptoms would be much worse having had that telephone call. So it's unlikely that any pathology I have in my gut has got worse in that 3-day period. But what's happened is I've become anxious, and it's that anxiety that's exacerbating the symptoms I initially presented with. So just because someone is somatizing, it doesn't mean they're odd or weird or unusual. We can all do it. But we all do it at times. However, some people who have called chronic somatizers basically do it all the time, and they can present with somatized illnesses, and you'll be familiar with the whole panoply of these illnesses. So for example, non-cardiac chest pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, also referred to as ME, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis, terrible name, don't use it. Irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, and then the two last ones are kind of in vogue at the moment: functional neurological symptom disorder, abbreviated to FND, and somatic symptom disorder. So these are basically names given to clusters of symptoms. They're not diagnostic, they're a kind of shorthand to describe what the patient's presented with. I can go into the last two in more detail if we have time at the end. Could I move on, Mark? Yeah. So it's important that if someone presents with somatized, i.e. emotionally driven symptoms, that we accept that they're real. They're just as valid as organically derived symptoms. So they're not being made up, they're not being imagined. And I say this to people when I see them in my clinic. They've maybe been referred with dizziness or something. I say, look, I believe you. You don't have to convince me that you're dizzy. But you know, the good news is your tests show that you don't have a brain tumor to account for your dizziness, but clearly you've got symptoms, you've got signs, and we have to try and understand what's causing them. So we believe you, they're not all in your head, they're not imagined. Somatized symptoms are really common, 30% of GP consultations, and importantly, the third point there, you can also have somatic symptoms in the presence of organic disease, but if organic disease is identified, it doesn't fully account for the symptom profile. Okay, so it's not symptoms are either physically derived or they're somatized. Commonly, there's an organic component to them as well. So that might be somebody who's, say, had a heart attack, they've been investigated, they've got some evidence of coronary artery disease, they've had stenting, and they persist in having cardiac pain. So that cardiac pain is not a consequence of furring up of their arteries, because that's been treated, albeit that they do have cardiac disease, but their ongoing symptoms are probably anxiety related to having another MI. So they do have cardiac disease, but anxiety is making the presentation much worse. Last one, it's a characteristic of somatized symptoms that they come and go and they fluctuate in severity. And they're also inconsistent with the anatomy. So if someone comes in complaining of numbness or tingling in their hands and feet, in somatized illness, somatized symptoms, it's unlikely that that's going to conform. The distribution of that is going to conform to the nerve, to the anatomy. And commonly you'll have seen this described as glove and stocking numbness. You can't get glove and stocking numbness if you adhere to the distribution of the nerves. They don't work like that. You might get numbness down one side of the hand and arm, but you'll not get it in a glove distribution. Okay, Mark? Any symptom can be somatized. So it's not just pain, it can be anything. It is commonly pain, but fatigue, dizziness, headache, dysphonia, numbness, tingling, weakness can all be somatized. Okay. This is quite important in that I think what you call somatized symptoms is it's worth taking some time to think about how you're going to describe them. And the symptoms can be referred to in a variety, by a variety of different terms. For example, medically unexplained. But that's not very comforting for a patient to be told you've got some medically unexplained symptoms. It kind of suggests that the doctor doesn't know what's happening. Psychogenic, well, you know, that's okay, but it's something to do with this, you know, the psyche, don't know, stress related. Some people say, yeah, but I'm not stressed. Hysterical, I wouldn't suggest that you use that. That's from the Greek word hystera, which is the word for the womb. And the ancient Greeks thought that behavioral and emotional disturbance could be related to a wandering womb, hence hysterical. I think we've moved on a wee bit, but it's not well accepted if you call a symptom hysterical. Functional, which is what I would tend to call them, i.e. you're suggesting that the bodily system or the nervous system, for example, is intact, but it's not functioning correctly. It's misfiring and producing these symptoms. Okay, Mark? This is quite an interesting thing. John Stone, you might be familiar with him, he's a neurologist in Edinburgh. A while ago, published this paper in the BMJ. And he studied 86 new neurology patients who had presented with functional symptoms, motor weakness. And he asked them to rate the adjectives used to describe their symptoms for offence. So number to offend. And the patients found the highly offensive to be told that the symptoms were all in their mind, hysterical, no surprise there, or medically unexplained, because that just caused confusion. So what is it, doctor? And the least offensive was functional. So functional seems to be a reasonable term to employ when you're speaking to patients about their somatized symptoms. There's a problem with the way your nervous system is functioning. It's not diseased. That's good news. We have to try and understand, what's causing it to malfunction. Okay, Mark. Who somatizes? Well, some people are more predisposed than others, and people who have experienced illness in childhood coupled with lack of parental care are predisposed. So you can understand that that might be a child from a chaotic family, parents separated, and they don't feel that they're being adequately cared for when they're unwell. Where there's the history of family illness, then that can predispose. For example, someone presenting with non-cardiac chest pain, and we're trying to explain that this is a psychologically, a stress-related illness you have, is going to be difficult to convince if they have a family history of MIs, because they'll attribute their symptoms to cardiac disease because they have a model for that in their family. Children who have suffered adversity and abuse are very predisposed to somatize, and it does seem there's quite a lot of work in this, and it does seem that childhood adversity affects the way the nervous system is laid down and matures, such that that individual becomes predisposed to developing somatized symptoms in adult life. So when you speak to these people, they often have a story of having a hard time in childhood. Women who present with chronic pelvic pain, not uncommonly, have a history of childhood sexual abuse. Genetics, yeah, there is a familial component that runs through families, but it's not possible to identify, the culpable gene for somatization. Okay, thanks. So that was the predisposing factors, precipitating factors, so the why now stuff. Well, people will commonly present when in stressful situations. It might be relationship breakdown, it might be difficulties at work, it might be a bereavement, something that has upset their emotional well-being. Because remember, these illnesses are emotionally driven. So a change in that individual's emotional health might trigger somatization if they are predisposed to do so. And the emotional change needn't be a sort of barn door psychiatric illness, such as an anxiety disorder or depression. It can be psychological upset. Now, clearly, if they do have anxiety or depression, you would want to treat that, because if you treat the mental illness that you've identified and remove it from the equation, chances are they will somatize less. So it's important to try and identify a treatable psychiatric illness in the hope that if you treat it, the somatized symptoms will become less troublesome. Minor injury, you'll be well kind of acquainted with that. So someone perhaps predisposed to somatizing, they sustain some sort of soft tissue injury to their back, and then they develop a chronic pain syndrome. Okay, Mark. So what keeps it going? Well, I think medics have got to hold up their hand here, because the way you tell it is important, and doctors will, if someone comes along to the doctor and they've been investigated for back pain, for example, and they've had x-rays and scans, and the doctor says, oh, good news, your scans are all fine, there's no evidence of cord compression, there's no surgical target, So there's no, operation available here. Isn't that good? People who chronically somatize will agree that it's good, but that reassurance is short-lived because they have worry about having something. They worry about having some physical or problem or some injury that the tests haven't revealed. So although you can tell people, what they don't have, i.e. you don't have a disc prolapse, if you don't tell the patient why they have symptoms, they're not going to move on. So you have to say, you don't have an organic problem, but what we think is happening here is that, however you want to phrase it, stress or anxiety or a change in your circumstances has caused you a kind of upset in your nervous system, and that is fueling your pain. So to give them a model of understanding, not just say, you don't have a prolapsed disc. So often you'll be aware that someone who's got chronic somatized symptoms, their life changes, they might not be able to go to work, might not be able to earn, they might be in receipt of social benefits, and often there will be a kind of collusion going on with their spouse or their family, who kind of, if the patient doesn't buy into the idea that these are psychologically driven and I've got some undiscovered organic or physical problem, they then share that worry with the family, and the family just kind of fuel the whole thing. So it's not uncommon for me to see someone with, for example, chronic back pain in my clinic, and then the patient will say, "Can you speak to my wife or my partner?" And the partner comes in with a well-rehearsed diatribe, really, about how we need to try harder to identify what's going on here. If we'd only done the correct scan, we would have found out that there's a fracture or something pressing on a nerve. So if these two people together are convinced that there's illness there and it's undiscovered, it's not been identified, then the chances of the affected individual moving towards considering there might be a psychological component is pretty remote. Threat of withdrawal of social benefits, well, that causes anxiety as well, and any escalation in anxiety will worsen the somatized symptoms. Involvement in litigation for the same reason, that could be stressful, worry about how it's all going to play out. So that anxiety as well is exacerbating the symptoms or maintaining the symptoms. And also people, chronic somatizers, have got this fear of disease I've touched on. So they worry about the medical seriousness of their symptoms. They're not reassured by negative test results other than temporarily. And they tend to want more and more tests because they're convinced that if we were only to do the right test, we would discover the source of the problems, which they consider to be organic. Okay, next slide. That sounded horribly like Chris Whitty there at a COVID conference. So I just wanted to maybe give you a wee model here. So I've got to try and give the individual a model of understanding. And if we think about NEADs, non-epileptic attack disorder, or pseudoseizures versus epilepsy. So if someone falls down in the street and twitches with tonic-clonic contractions, to a casual passerby, they would think they're having an epileptic fit. So lose consciousness and start convulsing. That person will then go to be referred to the first seizure clinic in a general hospital. They'll see a neurologist. They'll be investigated. And if they've got epilepsy, what you'll identify is a group somewhere in their brain of abnormal brain cells that don't behave, and they tend to spontaneously discharge electricity, for want of a better word. And that discharge passes across the brain, and if it hits the top bit, which controls consciousness, that individual will lose consciousness and fall to the ground. And if the electricity spreads down the spinal cord and out nerves to muscles, then the muscles will start to contract rhythmically and you'll get the kind of seizure activity. So that's the pathway. However, if that individual's investigated in neurology and there's a knot of abnormal brain cells that spontaneously discharge is not identified, but the patient is still falling down and having tonic-clonic contractions, how do you explain that? Well, quite a useful model is to say, well, something is activating these pathways, which in epilepsy are being activated by a discharge from abnormal cells. You don't have abnormal cells. So where is this brain activity coming from that's activating the pathways that cause you to lose consciousness and twitch? And we also know that any kind of emotional change, stress, anxiety, depression, worry, any emotional change is associated with what we call changes in regional brain activity. So if someone's anxious, this sort of anxiety area in their brain will be active. And in some people, just depending on how they're wired, that physiological brain activity might spread to the area that controls consciousness, and it might travel down the spinal cord and out through motor nerves to cause twitching. So provided these pathways are activated by some kind of brain activity, it's going to present like epilepsy. But if the brain activity is generated through some physiological change, i.e. some emotional change, it's not epilepsy, it's a non-epileptic attack disorder. But if you explain it like that, some people will say, oh yeah, I get that. He doesn't think I'm making this up. It doesn't think that I'm fabricating this. He's told me what might be going on. I'll maybe buy into that. And then if you say, well, if you buy into that idea, if we can perhaps try and understand what's caused the emotional upset that's created the brain activity that's triggering the pathways, we might be able to help you. Okay, Mark, let's move on. Yeah, consequences of chronic somatization. People tend to get over-investigated. Some of that can be quite invasive. I've seen people who have had their bladder removed for persistent bladder pain, in the hope that that works. That creates huge problems. They tend to present to hospital, they go to their doctor, they present to hospital out of hours. There's a kind of revolving door admission thing that goes on. If they've got a pain syndrome, they'll often use their drugs excessively, and they can become opioid dependent. I mentioned their symptoms can cause significant functional impairment, financial difficulties. If the family, although they might collude, there might also be significant stress, there might be family breakdown. They go back to the doctor all the time. They repeatedly ask for second opinions and more tests, and the relationship is often a bit fraught. And doctors ungraciously will often refer to these individuals as kind of heart sink patients. Not a good term. The next one, Mark, please. We don't need to go into this in a lot of detail. I can if you want, but this is a DSM-5 diagnostic category. And basically, the criteria are presentation with lots of distressing physical symptoms with significant disruption on a day-to-day basis. Now, it can be abdominal pain, headache, dizziness, anything you want. It's commonly pain. So if someone presents with pain that has these characteristics, you would in DSM, you would tend to classify that as somatic symptom disorder. The complaints are often non-specific, i.e. fatigue, exhaustion, I've got to sit down after walking 100 yards. And there's also this disproportionate and persistent anxiety about the seriousness of the symptoms. So they worry endlessly that their symptoms are indicative of some underlying occult physical disorder or injury. They've got prominent health anxiety, and as I mentioned before, negative test results are only temporarily reassuring. Okay, can I go to the next one, Mark? The they're very difficult to treat. They don't respond well to treatment. They're kind of anxious that the treatment is going to do them more harm. They tend to represent with lots of difficult to understand drug side effects, or probably not side effects, but they consider them as side effects. They're very complaintive about the medical care, and importantly, they tend not to believe there's an emotional or psychological component at play. Okay, next one. Functional neurological disorder is a kind of subset of somatic symptom disorder, but the symptoms are exclusively neurological, and there might be weakness, tremor, gait abnormalities, abnormal posturing. Okay, next one, Mark. And the sensory ones are as you see it. Globus is you'll be aware, is a sensation of something stuck in your throat, inability to swallow. They often regurgitate food, and I've spoken about non-epileptic attacks. Last thing, in functional, yeah, okay, we'll go into this. This is just that, yeah, okay, just let's go on, Mark. You know, not all unexplained symptoms are somatized. Some might be made up, and clearly this is important in your field of work. If these made up symptoms are clearly for some kind of external gain, and that might be compensation, then that's called malingering. Or if the symptoms are made up because the patient needs to be cared for, they have a pathological need to occupy the sick role, that's called fictitious disorder. Old term is Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen was a German aristocrat about 200 years ago who tended to impress people with his fantastic stories of daring do. It's quite a catchy kind of way of describing it, but it doesn't really, I think it's a bit outdated. So fictitious disorder or malingering. Okay. I don't know if there are any more slides, Mark. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that in my experience, the drivers behind symptoms can change. So if someone falls off a ladder, has a minor back injury, they might for a while, a couple of months, have symptoms from a soft tissue injury, but then they might fall out with their employers. They might start experiencing financial difficulty. Their pay stops. They get anxious about that. And what were initially organically derived symptoms from their back injury become somatized because they've become anxious, and then they might get involved in litigation. And for in order to see that through to a satisfactory conclusion in their eyes, they might start gilding the lily. And I think people can kind of move up and down that spectrum. So it's not as though your symptoms are either, purely organic, purely somatized, or feigned. I think you've got to try and tease out from the big melting pot of symptoms what might be going on. Thanks.
Dr. Stewart, thank you very much for that. I think we've got a few minutes at the end for questions. So if anybody has any questions, I'll stop sharing for now. If anybody has any questions, please do unmute yourself and ask. I wonder if I could prevail on you, Dr. Stewart. One of the issues I wondered about was, if you have a case where someone they're potentially somatizing, or you're not sure the reason for that, how much weight can we give, or can a psychiatrist give, to surveillance? For example, if it shows the pursuer or claimant to be physically capable of more than they claim. Yes. I wondered, from your point of view, does that alone critically or otherwise undermine the reliability of what they tell you and whether you believe them? Or is it more nuanced than that, and we need to look at maybe the bigger picture of self-reporting, to whom, for what reasons, before, as a psychiatrist, you could give a view on whether you're looking at someone malingering, or whether there's another there's more to it than that?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think in terms of surveillance and somatized symptoms, you've got to remember that somatized symptoms are emotionally driven, and they fluctuate and can change. So, for example, you know, in medical practice, if someone has a tremor and they're coming into the clinic and they're worried about what might be going on in the clinic, then the tremor will get worse. And it's not uncommon for that person because of the anxiety. And it's not unusual if you watch that person, you know, walking down the corridor, or you see them again in the concourse, their tremor's not nearly so bad because they're not so anxious. So I suppose if you've got insomatized symptoms, the surveillance might show the individual being more able than reported. But I suppose, you know, you'd have to take into account that they could be having a good day. You know, they might, but so it's not conclusive, I don't think. I think if we're, it's helpful, but it's not conclusive. And I think that if in surveillance, it's probably more instructive if there's surveillance conducted on a number of occasions over a period of time, because it's unlikely to have, you know, 6, 8, 10 good days. So I think you'd probably, I wouldn't place too much emphasis on you know, 20 minutes of surveillance evidence on one day. And I do think that it's also really important to pay attention to what they have told to different people. I mean, so the patient or client reporting is clearly something that we should try and flesh out. I mean, for example, I saw a woman recently who told me that because of her leg injury, she couldn't perform at work as before, and was now doing reduced hours. I accepted that, but then an employment report became available, and in fact, since her injury, she had on 2 consecutive years received performance-related bonuses.
I think we've got Chris Kelly McFadden has raised his hands. Chris, if you want to unmute yourself, please go for it and ask away.
Hi, yeah, thank you. My question is for Dr. Stewart as well. And what I was wondering is, are there any reliable clinical methods that we can use to distinguish between someone who has genuine somatic symptoms and someone who's perhaps malingering?
Well, yes, I mean, there are some neurological tests. I mean, you've probably come across neurologists reporting Hoover's sign, and it's supposed to help distinguish between, you know, an organic weakness, say a leg weakness, for example, and a somatized weakness. And what you do is you get the patient to lie down on the bed, and if that patient's got an organic weakness, if you ask them to lift the affected weak leg, but put your hand underneath the back of their thigh on the good side, in organic weakness, you'll feel the patient pushing down into your hand, trying to lift their leg, which is paralyzed. And if the weakness of the leg is functional, they won't press down into the bed with the contralateral limb. So there are some things, but it's and that adds to the, you know, to the reporting, to the surveillance and the tests. But you know, that Hoover's test is something quite specific for limb weakness. Not all symptoms you can test. For example, you couldn't test fatigue.
Okay, I'm conscious we've ran a little over, not too bad, only a couple of minutes or so. But if anybody, I'll just wrap this up unless anybody wants to take a final opportunity to ask a question. If you don't want to do so over the medium of a webinar, please feel free to contact either by email. Quite happy to field any queries in that regard. We can take it forward from there. But if nobody has any further questions, then thank you all again for attending. Hopefully it's been of some value to you. Certainly, from my perspective, I understand somatization and symptoms a bit better than I did before. So thank you for that, Dr. Stewart, and your time this afternoon. If there's nothing else, I just wish you a good afternoon. Thanks very much again for attending.
Thanks very much.